exploration, Isro is all set to lead from the front. And without mincing his words, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has made his position crystal clear to the Chinese president at BRICS summit. And former US President Donald Trump is rewriting laws of politics after turning his mugshot into a campaign symbol. Hello and a very warm welcome to World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Those are some of our top stories. But first up are the headlines. In an arrest that saw the first ever mugshot of a former US president, Donald Trump surrenders in Georgia on charges of plotting to overturn the state's 2020 election results. Russian President Vladimir Putin will not attend the G20 summit in India in person, confirms Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov. He said the format of Putin's participation would be determined later. Putin did not attend last year's G20 summit in Bali and similarly stayed away from the recently concluded BRICS summit in Johannesburg. As Russia denies any involvement in Yevgeny Prigozhin's death, people across the country continue to pay tribute to the Wagner leader, laying flowers and lighting candles. And Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is conferred with the Grand Cross of the Order of Honour by the Greek President in Athens. Let's dive into the segment with our top focus on Chandrayaan 3. After a historic touchdown on the lunar South Pole on Wednesday, the Indian Space Research Organisation, or Isro, has shared a video of the Chandrayaan 3. The video shows how the Chandrayaan 3 rover ramped down from the lander and is rolling on the moon's surface for the first time. Indeed, it was a defining moment for India as it became the first nation to land on the lunar South Pole. So how will India's historic lunar exploration make it stand out as a space power? Let's find out in our special report.
India has successfully landed on the moon. Not only does that have implications for the future of lunar exploration, but also the country's standing as a space power. Here's what you need to know about the Chandrayaan 3 mission. The mission was launched on July 14th and was headed to the moon's South Pole, where no one's been before. The South Pole is home to frozen water, which could be a source of water, oxygen, and fuel. That opens up possibilities for future missions, moon mining, or even a colony. The Chandrayaan 3 lander is about the size of an SUV. Explorers will now spend 2 weeks running experiments, including analyzing the mineral composition of the moon's surface. India's previous attempt to land on the lunar South Pole failed in 2019. Rough terrain is one of the complications of a South Pole landing. But India's space agency says it made adjustments this time that made it more likely to stick the landing. The successful mission makes India the 4th country to land on the moon, just ahead of national elections next year. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's government is looking to spur investment in private space launches and satellite-based businesses. India has said it wants private space companies to increase their share of the global launch market by 5-fold within the next decade.
So what will this historic feat mean for India's future space explorations, also the lunar explorations? Let's try and find out from our space commentator, Mr. Jonathan Levy, who's joining me live right now. Many thanks to you, Mr. Levy, for sharing your precious time with us. India now has technological superiority because it's the first and the only lunar mission on Moon's South Pole compared to other spacefaring countries. How can data from Chandrayaan 3 provide India an edge over other countries in future space missions?
Well, it's entering in a very exciting phase now. It's sort of getting down to business. The next sort of 12 days will be crucial. Your space agency announced earlier today that it's turned on the scientific instruments on the rover, right, the Pragyan rover. So these will be doing an X-ray spectrometer analysis to understand the composition and the minerals in the soil, and then another instrument, a laser breakdown spectroscope, will look at the individual elements that are there. So this will be vital information for understanding the composition at the South Pole that nations across the world are eyeing as a very critical place for the next steps to send people back to the moon and create a base on the South Pole. So this information is adding to not just India's knowledge, but the whole of humanity's knowledge about this part of the moon. Very critical, as well as the instruments that are also on the lander itself.
It's interesting that you talk about the overall human quest for space exploration, which is why that brings me to my next question. Former Isro chairman, Mr. Kasturi Rangan, has also said that so far India was not part of the elite space club and was denied access to critical technology because we were also dependent on other countries. But with this lunar landing, will India now become part of the decision-making process in space, considering space capabilities are now important even in international affairs?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think just the way that that Isro troubleshooted what happened with the previous attempt and quickly put in new steps to look at the landing site before the attempted landing from orbit, and then to hover and make sure it was safe to land. All these different things are very clever pieces of technology developed very, very quickly. And I think it maybe opened some people's eyes, at the ability of India to work at this level. I don't think it really comes as a surprise to the scientists, but maybe more so to the politicians. And, India is being taken seriously, not only in what it can achieve itself, but as a major player now, as partners with the world community and when it comes to space, whether it be joint missions with Japan or with the United States or other countries such as those represented by the European Union through the European Space Agency.
I'm glad you mentioned those future collaborations with Japan and the United States. Many thanks to you, Mr. Levy, for joining in. It was a pleasure to have you on World 360.
My pleasure.
And with that, let's shift focus over to the BRICS. Amid the standoff at LAC, Prime Minister Narendra Modi had a candid and in-depth exchange of views on current China-India relations with Chinese President Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the BRICS summit in Johannesburg. India's Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra said Prime Minister Modi highlighted India's concerns on the unresolved issues along the LAC in the western sector of India-China border. Now, Prime Minister also underlined the maintenance of peace and tranquility in the border areas. He said that observing and respecting the LAC are essential for the normalization of relationship. The two leaders agreed to direct relevant officials to intensify efforts at expeditious disengagement and de-escalation. Interestingly, the MEA sources have also indicated that there was a pending request from the Chinese side for a bilateral meeting with India. Meanwhile, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin said the border issue is a historical legacy and not the entirety of China-India relations. It should be placed in an appropriate position in bilateral relations and be resolved through peaceful and friendly negotiations to find a just, reasonable and mutually acceptable solution. And what did this informal meeting mean in terms of the international geopolitical implications? Let me introduce my guest today. I'm joined in by Mr. Einar Tangan, who's a China geostrategist. As far as the geopolitical developments are concerned, Mr. Tangan, will BRICS be able to sort of inject a new lease of life as far as overall BRICS summit is concerned? Also with regards to the informal meeting between President Xi and Modi, is the LAC now becoming the biggest test of diplomacy for India and China, going by what the two heads of states had to exchange?
Well, that's how India defines it. India has been very clear that the border situation is the defining issue. So based on the prior, what it appears to be instructions by both leaders at the Bali conference, that they come together and reach some sort of consensus or development, the numerous meetings that have gone on. Unfortunately, the last military-to-military meeting, which lasted unusually for 2 days, did not seem to garner a consensus. So it's not clear. But I can tell you what is clear. The disputes between China and India will not be settled militarily. This is an issue about security. It will be settled diplomatically. And as soon as people realize that and come to the table in good faith, I think there can be a global settlement, not just about what area of land is controlled where, but where there should be a mutually agreeable border so that both countries can get on about their business.
Perhaps, which is why the Prime Minister also said that a prerequisite for a healthy bilateral relationship is going to be peace and tranquility at the LAC. But my first part of the question is what I'm going to come back to you again for, Mr. Tangan. Considering the war or the impact on global economy and supply chains, can the geopolitical developments of the past year or the challenges being faced by the UN sort of inject a new lease of life to BRICS?
Well, let's define what the BRICS is. It's a middle power grouping. It is reshaping global geopolitical and economic landscape.
Right.
Its GDP is larger than the G7. And it brings a combination of resources, production, and markets. So it represents the multipolar reality. It provides a consensus versus corporate model of governmental development globally. So at this juncture, it's not the UN that's failing. It is those countries who are undermining the UN, undermining the WTO, that have pushed countries to find alternatives. It's the tech wars. It's the physical kinetic wars that are out there. People are looking, especially in the global south, for a vision of prosperity, predictability, which is not being provided by the usual sources, the G7.
Right. Many thanks to you, Mr. Tangan, for sharing those inputs so eloquently with us. And with that, let's shift focus over to the United States. Former US President Donald Trump has surrendered at the Atlanta jail in Georgia, where he faces 13 criminal charges over alleged attempts to subvert the results of the 2020 presidential election. Now, Donald Trump was fingerprinted, and a booking photo, commonly known as a mugshot, was also taken of the former US president, and later it has been released in public too. Now, Trump is facing charges in 4 separate criminal cases, but this is the first time he had a mugshot click. Trump is facing 13 separate counts in Georgia, including a racketeering charge and several fraud and false statement counts. Trump's lawyers had agreed to bail terms with the Fulton County District Attorney as well, including a $200,000 bond and a pledge not to intimidate witnesses. And with that, let me also shift focus over to the first primary Republican debate. 8 Republican presidential candidates have faced off for the first debate of the 2024 election cycle, this in Milwaukee this week. Indian-American entrepreneur Vivek Ramaswamy's popularity rating and online fundraising have surged on Thursday, just a day after the maiden Republican presidential debate. And according to the Ramaswamy campaign, the 38-year-old presidential aspirant has raised more than $450,000 with an average donation of $38 in the first hour after the debate. Now, the entrepreneur turned politician was being hit hard by 3 of his top rivals. And who are those top rivals? Let me tell you about them. Former New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, former Vice President Mike Pence, and even South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley. Let's also listen in to what Vivek Ramaswamy had to say.
I started at 0.0 in March. I'm now, probably a second. Look at some of the recent polls, and we'll see how things go after tonight. I would call myself the second place in this race. It's going to be a 2-horse race between me and Donald Trump before long, and I'm the only person that can win in a landslide, and I think that's the difference.
And so 2 important developments in the United States, Donald Trump's surrender and the first Republican primary debate, of course, shifted the spotlight on Ramaswamy. But does that make him a promising alternative to Donald Trump? Also, what will Georgia's indictment and Trump's subsequent surrender mean for the presidential race? Here's my interview with conservative strategist Amy Tarkanian and senior U.S. journalist Ray Locker.
Amy, why does the Georgia case, this particular indictment, stand apart from other criminal proceedings against this former president, especially in context of Georgia's racketeering law, the RICO law?
Sure. Well, it involves 18 other people, so it's not just himself. So you have a number of folks who are having to divulge information on this scenario. And so you now have also the factor in, you can talk about the phone call that he made to the Secretary of State of Georgia, and you can interpret that a number of ways, where he said that he wanted to find 11,700 more votes. That could either be a candidate who was in panic and just talking out loud, or it could have been somebody who truly was putting the pressure on. But the thing I think he's going to have a tough time wiggling his way out of is the fake elector scheme.
Right. Ray, if I could bring you in on this aspect, what could be the implications for Trump's political future as far as the Georgia indictment is concerned?
Well, obviously, if he's convicted, he's going to have to serve time, or he's going to have some kind of sentence against him. That doesn't help anybody, not even him. Does it help him get the Republican nomination? Certainly, based on last night's debate, probably would help him. Nobody else rose to the occasion and presented a really strong contrast. And everybody knows that he's not favored in a general election, no matter what the polls say. So it just does not help him, and it's insane to believe that it does.
Do you think that Vivek could come up as a more promising candidate or an alternate to Donald Trump? Are other Republican support base, the Republican support base largely of Donald Trump, is there any chance to look at him as a more friendly alternate to Donald Trump? So
Ramaswamy did well enough last night in the eyes of some people. If his poll support rises, they're all going to go after him during the next debate. They would have gone after Ron DeSantis if they thought that he was a credible alternative. And the fact that he didn't draw any fire is not good news for him.
Amy, talking about Ramaswamy, there's been a lot of chatter around him here in India as well, of course, because of his ethnicity. But I'd like to draw your attention to his political ideologies. He's someone who's talked about, at the Nixon Library, he spoke about decoupling with China. If he comes to power, he said that he'll stop aid to Ukraine. He's also spoken about how the current US presidents need to learn from Nixon, who soured relations between China and Russia, and that if he were to come power, he would reduce Moscow's economic burdens. Do you think speaking these hard truths is is this his way of solidifying his position as a more reliable alternative to Donald Trump?
Well, let's not forget we have another individual who's also of Indian ethnicity in the race, and that's Nikki Haley. So it's not just Vivek, but Vivek is a really good speaker. There's no question. He's also really good at throwing out red meat and talking points to the base. However, your sister station CNN out here, he went on a few days ago with Caitlin Collins, and I happened to catch that interview, and he could not answer and respond to some of the questions that Caitlin had pointed out, and actually used his own words. And he fell apart and became extremely snarky and immature. And so I think that was very telling. You also had Vice President Mike Pence point that out as well, that this is not a job that you learn as you go. And so I think it was pretty telling to see the difference in those who are seasoned, who know the ins and outs of how Washington works.
And here's news from Russia, which grabbed international headlines. Russia's Wagner chief Yevgeny Prigozhin's sudden death in a plane crash sparked conspiracy theories and suggestions that Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin were involved in the accident. The private jet in which Prigozhin was traveling seemed to have a seamless record of good safety. According to reports, it was traveling fine unless the last 30 seconds saw the jet mysteriously drop to lower altitudes, finally crashing, killing all on board, including the mercenary Wagner Group's chief. Now, the Kremlin has said that it was an absolute lie that they were involved in Wagner mercenary boss Yevgeny Prigozhin's death in the plane crash. The Russian authorities have cited the need to wait for test results. What will this mean for the overall scenario as far as Wagner's operations are concerned, also for the war in Ukraine. Let's try and get in a sense of perspective. And for that, I'm joined in by Fred Ware, who's a Russian affairs expert. Also, Ben Aris, who's the editor-in-chief at Business New Europe. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining in. Ben, if I could begin with you, what happens to the Wagner Force now, especially as far as operations that they were conducting in Africa and Syria?
Yeah, what happens now? Well, there's it's a little bit up in the air in so much as there's different reports, and you have to realize that after the attempt at the mutiny in June, that Wagner got broken up to some extent. Some of the fighters went with Prigozhin to Belarus, but others were offered to sign contracts and join the army. And in addition to those that were in Ukraine and then went into Rostov and ended up in Minsk, there's another huge contingent of Wagner troops that are in Africa, and they've been there for years, since 2014, who are fighting various insurrections or supporting the government in places like Mali. And those operations, those fighters have always been there and are still there. And now that Prigozhin is gone, I think the question is what's going to happen to the troops in Europe. Some, as I say, have joined the regular Russian army. Some of them are moving to other private military companies, and some, the ones in Minsk,
right.
They're reportedly moving back to their base just outside Ukraine, down on the border.
All right, Fred, if I could bring you in on this bit in terms of the future of the Wagner Force, what happens now, especially to those operations in Africa and Syria?
I think that the lesson for Putin and the Russian establishment is don't let these freelancers get out of hand. It's better not to have them in the first place. The whole reason that Putin did let Wagner develop was to keep operations under the radar screen, to sort of enforce some Russian foreign policy goals without being seen to be deniable. But look how badly that blew back in the Kremlin's face. So I think I have no idea who killed Prigozhin and his lieutenants. It's one of those horrible things that happen in Russia, and you know that it's the product of the political system, but it's not necessarily just Putin's revenge or some of the simplistic things. I think there are a lot of actors here. Prigozhin had a lot of enemies. Let's wait and find out. But anyway, it is the end of the Wagner era for sure.
Right. Ben, we all know that Wagner's presence has already been reduced in Ukraine, and that happened soon after the rebellion was over. Is Putin, by any chance, on the back foot now as far as this war is concerned, due to the end of the force that helped him win? And of course, the narrative that's been woven around the Wagner and Russian forces is that they won Bakhmut.
No, I don't think so. There was this very high-profile fight around Bakhmut, down in the Donbass, and that was more a PR exercise in so much as that Putin has not had any wins. I mean, and they lost considerably. They lost a considerable amount of territory in September in Kharkiv and then Kherson, and they needed some sort of PR victory to show the Russian public that the fight was going their way. And what they did is they threw Wagner into the Bakhmut fight, which was extremely brutal, extremely bloody, with very high casualty rates. And Putin didn't want to expend regular soldiers, conscripts in particular, in that fight. And so they tasked Wagner to do it. But militarily, strategically, the fight for Wagner didn't make much difference. I mean, it just was a PR win. And the Russian army, since September last year, since this disaster of the Kharkiv offensive, has been very much on the back foot. It's gone into a defensive mode. And in a way, that's to Russia's advantage because the casualty rate goes down. They built, as has been widely reported, extensive defenses. And now they're just letting the Ukrainians throw themselves on these defenses. And it's the Ukrainians who are taking the casualties. All right. And all said and done, Russia's population is 3.5 times larger than Ukraine's. And so they're just playing a long game here of attrition, and they're grinding down the Ukrainians on the assumption that Ukrainians are going to run out of men before the Russians do.
All right, many thanks to you, Ben and Fred, for joining in with all those details. And with that, it's time to slip into a quick break, but don't go anywhere, because in a bit after the break, we will tell you all about why China is banning seafood from Japan. We'll tell you all about it, but after a quick break.